Chapter 5 Reunion. With a burp of smoke billowing from its tailpipe, the Dodge exited the bridge and hopped onto Interstate 880. They'd headed south for another 10 miles as a comfortable silence descended over them. Faddy looked at the cars racing by and marvelled at their speed. He'd rarely left their house on Shogun Street these past few years. Although the Taliban had brought some order to the city, it still hadn't been safe to go outside. Zafuna had decided to homeschool Fadi Noor and Mariam, especially since all the girls' schools had been closed by the Taliban. Fadi stared at the new white strands in his father's hair and couldn't help but feel sorry for him. His father had wanted to go back to Afghanistan to help, but it just hadn't turned out that way. Initially, he'd hoped to teach at the agriculture department at Kabul University. Founded in 1931, the university had been one of the finest in Asia, the intellectual heart of the country. But after years of war, it was in shambles and had to be shut down. Habib had opened a small dry goods store in downtown Kabul to support the family after the opium crops had been destroyed. Every once in a while, his father would take Fadi to work with him. Downtown Kabul's maze of streets was usually jam-packed with cars, donkey carts and people on foot. Fadi gazed out of the window at the tall walls that lined either side of the freeway, sheltering buildings, shopping plazas and parks on the other side. Everything looked so big and so new. Uncle Amin eased his way into the right lane and took the Thornton Avenue exit into Fremont. They passed an elementary school and drove along a street lined with shops, tea houses, restaurants and a small theatre. Fadi rolled down the window to let in the fresh air and he caught a whiff of freshly baked bread. He could see signs in familiar Persian script on many of the shop fronts. "Here we are, little Kabul, home away from the real thing," joked Uncle Amin with a rumbling laugh. "Really?" asked Habib, looking out the side window. A group of women in long dresses and headscarves strolled by. "Fremont has the largest population of Afghans in the United States," said Uncle Amin. "There are dozens of Afghan restaurants, cafes and shops. You can drop by and get a cup of tea and hear the latest news." "That must be nice," said Zafuna. "Yes, it is. Nilufer can find all the ingredients she needs to make her famous kebabs and poulos." The mention of kebabs got Fadi's stomach rumbling. He hadn't eaten much on the plane and he was hungry. "Ah, here we are," said Uncle Amin. He took a right turn down a residential street and pulled up next to a single-storey brown shingle house with overgrown rose bushes out front. They had just stepped down out of the car when the front door burst open and a group of women and children came flying out. "You're here!" cried a woman in a flowering dress. She looked like a younger version of Zafuna, but her hair was cut fashionably short and her eyes were leaf green. "Nilufer!" cried Zafuna, stumbling forward to give her sister an enveloping hug. Without warning, they both burst into tears and started talking at once. "Jish," said Salme. He exchanged an embarrassed look with Fadi, who grinned in return. Behind Zafuna and Nilufer stood an elderly couple, who Fadi guessed were Abe, grandmother, and Dada, grandfather, Uncle Amin's parents. Habib moved forward to kiss the old woman's cheeks. "Salam alaikum," he said reverently. "How good it is to see you." "I am so thankful to Allah you are here safely," she said, her voice as wispy as a spider's web. She kissed Habib's forehead and then his cheeks. Cocooned in the flow of people, Fadi and his family were bundled into the house. Over the next half an hour, Fadi met a blur of people, which included Uncle Amin's 2 brothers and their wives and children. Zafuna was settled in a bedroom for a quick nap, despite her protests that she wanted to help, while the other women retreated to the kitchen to prepare endless platters of food. The men caught up on the latest news and the kids set out plates and cutlery. "Let me say a prayer before we begin lunch," said Uncle Amin an hour later. The family sat around the traditional dastarkan, a tablecloth laid out on the floor on top of which the food was placed. Let us thank Allah that Brother Habib and his family have made it safely to San Francisco." As he paused, Fadi's back stiffened. "May Allah also be watching over brave little Mariam, who, inshallah, will soon be found and brought here to us." "There are dozens of people looking for her," said Habib. "She'll be found very soon." "Father's right. She'll be found soon," thought Fadi. "There are so many people looking for her." And the knot between his shoulder blades eased a bit. "Ameen," came murmurs from people around the room. Fadi glanced at his mother and tears pooled along her eyelashes. The familiar feeling of guilt returned, though he pushed it back. He looked around the room at the solemn faces. Even the younger kids were quiet. They must have been horrified at the thought of being lost out in the middle of nowhere, by themselves. What if they knew it was my fault Mariam was lost? They'd hate me. Conversation buzzed around him, about their escape, about Mariam. "Poor Bacha," came a whisper near his ear. Startled, Fadi turned to see Abe had settled down next to him. She placed a soft hand on Fadi's shoulder and pulled him in for a hug. Fadi stiffened, then melted into her embrace, which smelled of cardamom and cinnamon. He wondered if she could read the guilt in his face, and he avoided her probing eyes and averted his face. Abe patted him on the face and passed him a glass of fizzy orange drink. He gulped it down, the coolness easing the dryness in his throat. Steaming plates of food were passed around as Habib told them how, although neither the American consulate nor Nargis had tracked down Mariam yet, it was only a matter of time before she'd be found. The UN Refugee Agency has sent out a bulletin about Mariam, and Habib's professor and his sons were looking for any news of her in Jalalabad. Kala Nilufer piled a mound of Kabuli pulao rice and lamb onto Fadi's plate. He dug in, savouring the candied carrots and raisins. There was also spinach, fried eggplant with yogurt and chicken stew. Abe added 2 mantu to his plate. Fadi stared down at the 2 plump dumplings smothered in meat sauce, and his hunger vanished. Mantu was Mariam's favourite dish. After lunch, Fadi wandered towards the back of the small house, wanting to get away from the crush. Zalmay had offered to show him his collection of video games, but he wasn't interested. He ducked inside the empty kitchen. The pantry door stood invitingly open, so he slipped inside. He slid to the ground between the huge bag of rice and the shelves packed with canned goods and spices. He'd been sitting for a few solitary minutes when he heard footsteps enter through the doorway. "So, what happened, Zafuna?" prodded a concerned voice. Fadi spotted Kala Nilufer through the gap between the door and the frame. He shrank into the shadows as chairs were pulled back from the small dinette set near the window. "It's all a blur," said Zafuna, her voice scratchy. We were at the appointed place when the truck arrived. It was late, well past midnight, and we hurried to get on board. Noor practically carried me because I was so sick. Habib led the way carrying the suitcases while Fadi and Mariam trailed behind. Then, within seconds, complete chaos descended over us. Dozens of people appeared from out of nowhere. There was a mad dash for the truck. "Oh my goodness," murmured Kala Nilufer. It's my fault she's lost, you know," whispered Zafuna. Fadi stiffened. Her fault? He peered through the crack at his mother's haunched shoulders. "Don't blame yourself, Zafuna Jan," cried Kala Nilufer. "She's my baby. I'm her mother. It's all my fault," cried Zafuna, and she burst into ragged sobs. Fadi could see her shoulders shaking as Kala Nilufer grabbed tissues. He closed his eyes, blocking out her tears, but he couldn't extinguish the anguished sounds. "Safuna," comforted Kala Nilufer, "you're making yourself sick. You can't think like this." "No, you don't understand," said Safuna. If I wasn't so sick, I could have looked after her, but instead everyone was looking after me. Noor and Habib were so worried about getting me on board the truck that they lost track of Fadi and Mariam. It's my fault." Fadi sank his fingernails into the bag of rice. It wasn't her fault. She wasn't the one responsible for losing Mariam. No, you can't think this way, Safuna Jan," soothed Nilufer. "You were sick. You can't help that." I don't know." Safuna paused for a few seconds. "I've always tried to be a good mother, but I've had to be the disciplinarian. Habib has always been the soft one, the one who the kids turn to when they skin their knees or want to share a secret. I hate to think that Mariam doesn't think I love or care for her." "Of course Mariam knows you love her," said Kala Nilufer forcefully. "You can tell her yourself when she comes home. There are so many people looking for her. She'll be found soon." "Inshallah," said Safuna softly. "Now, come sit in the backyard," said Kala Nilufer. "The fresh air will do you good. I'll make you a fresh pot of green tea." As the women headed to the backyard with their tea, Fadi sat alone in the dark. "It's where I deserve to be,"